Hi everybody. So my talk is about hunting and feeding in the sea, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think so far everything's been talking about things that have bones and things that live on land, which I think is very unfair because there's an awful lot of interesting stuff that lives in the sea too. So, my name's Christian. I'm studying my PhD at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory up on the Hoe, and I primarily work on jellyfish. So I'm interested in animals that don't have any bones, and how do creatures like that go about eating things, finding things to eat. So, first things first, the oceans are a very, very strange place full of very, very strange creatures. Does anybody know what that is off the top of their head? Yeah?
I've got the name, but it is kind of a shark.
It is a kind of shark. It's a goblin shark. But, yeah, the reason that the oceans are full of so many strange creatures is because the oceans are a really weird place. They are. In some places, they're very, very hot, up to like 400 degrees C. In some places, they're well below freezing. In some places, they're bright 24 hours a day. In other places, they're totally dark. And in some places, there's loads of food, and in other places, there's very little. And being as today's all about food, that's what I'm going to talk about. So in order to be an animal in the ocean, you need to be quite specialised, and not all animals are able to live in the ocean very well. So, but we're not interested in him. He's got bones. He's rubbish. Right. So, we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So, at the surface, there's lots of food. So, if you were an animal and you wanted to find lots of food, then one of the things that you could do is just try and stay near the surface. So, how do you think that you might stay at the surface if you were an animal? Yeah? Say again? Now, swimming is good, but swimming takes lots of energy to do all of the time. Is there anything you could do that wouldn't take as much energy? Yeah, in the middle?
Be buoyant.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. So, you could float like a balloon. And a couple of animals do that. Don't go, this is lovely. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah? It is. It's a Portuguese man-o-war. So the man-o-war lives on top of the water. It's got its balloon thing that sits above the water, and then all of its tentacles drift down into the water. And so the tentacles catch all the food, and the balloon just kind of keeps it where it is. So that's one way that it can ensure that it gets lots of food by staying at the surface. But what if you're a little bit further down? So here I've got my little orange circles, and they're going to represent our food. And here we have our wonderful little jelly. And he's not terribly big. And in his normal sort of day-to-day stuff, he only manages to pick up one food because he doesn't take up a lot of space and there's not very much food. So how do they get around this? Well, one way that they do it is some jellies are very, very good at sucking in water. So they've changed their bodies so that they can just slurp up everything that's nearby. And in particular, the salps are really good at this. So you can see from his barrel-shaped body, he's actually got a net on the inside of that body. You can almost just make it out. And by kind of slurping all the water that's around him, he's able to get lots of food from a relatively spread out environment of food. What about if you haven't got a net? So this is a larvation, and he's probably closest to like a tadpole that you get for frogs. And he hasn't got a net. But he still feeds by suction. So how does he do that? Well, he makes himself a house, and he makes it entirely out of mucus. So you know that stuff that comes out of your nose when you're not feeling very well and goes in the tissue? Well, you just throw it in the bin, which isn't very resourceful of you. If you were a larvation, what you do is you turn it into one of the most complicated structures that any animal makes. And what he does is, right up the front there, he's got sort of two holes that let water in, and by beating his tail, he pulls water down in towards the mouth where he can feed. And he wouldn't be able to feed at all if he didn't make this structure. So next time that you throw away a tissue, you should have done something more useful with it. So using his house, he's able to slurp up all of the water, all of the food that's in the surrounding water. Now, what about our humble little jellyfish? Because he can't suck up food in the way that the other two can. So if he's in this kind of food environment, what can he do? He's a bit stuck. What do you guys think? Yeah?
He makes a light to attract the food.
Good answer. We'll get back to that. Yeah.
He could open up his body and gulp it all up.
Kind of like that. And then one more at the top. Yeah.
He could use his tentacles to sweep it up because they have massive stinging ones.
Yep, absolutely. But there's a way that he does it that allows him to be able to make the most of the food that he's in. And the best way to explain it is to think about the jellyfish as a glass of squash. So when you pour squash into a glass, it's all concentrated, right? And you don't drink it as it is. It's only it would only be a tiny little drink and it'd be way too concentrated. When you want to drink it and you want to make it into a big drink, you add a ton of water, right? And by adding the water, you end up with a much bigger drink and you're much happier because you've got a nice big drink and that's good. So what jellies do is they dilute themselves just the way that you've diluted the squash. So you end up with a much bigger jellyfish. But it's still only from the same amount of stuff. They've just added a load of water to it. Now, if we do the same with our jellyfish, we can see he goes from being tiny to being absolutely massive. And now he can eat all of the food without a problem because he's added so much water that he's just massive now and he can just encounter all of the food really easily. And that's what you see with all of the jellies, pretty much every jelly species that you come across. Has everybody seen the moon jellies at the aquarium? Yeah. Good, aren't they? Jellies are very interesting. Right. Now, there's a couple of other weird ways that creatures go about finding food when there isn't too much around. And this guy on the left is called Lampeia. And he feeds on salps, which are the barrel-shaped things we saw earlier. But specifically, he feeds on chains of salps. Now, when food is really, really scarce, it doesn't make sense to try and suck it all up, because you're going to spend all that energy just trying to suck up water, and there's so little food there that you won't get enough to eat. But Lampeia has a very good plan about how to deal with this. What Lampeia does is it only finds food when it's absolutely tiny. So when it's first kind of born, and then when it first develops into a baby Lampeia, it drifts around, and while it's little, it doesn't need very much food. And while it's little, it finds a lovely long salp chain. And comparatively, the salp chain is massive because it's so tiny. So what it does is it latches onto the salp chain and it just munches and munches away. And gradually it gets bigger and bigger and just munches its way down the chain. And so what it does is it finds all of its food in one go, so that way it doesn't have to spend all of its time and energy finding food. And as soon as it's munched as much as it wants to, it just creates more baby Lampeia, and they go off and find chains of their own to eat. Now, what do you do when food is even more scarce than that? And we've touched on it already. Now, if you weren't looking, even if you were looking very, very carefully, this would look like something that we call a copepod. It's a tiny little crustacean that lives in the deep sea. And so if you were a jellyfish, not that jellyfish really use their eyes for eating, but they do have eyes. If you were a jellyfish hunting for food in the sea, you might go, oh, I found this tiny bit of food and there's no other food around, so I'll go and get that. But as the gentleman at the top pointed out, that might not be the best idea, because that little copepod might not be a copepod at all. It might be attached to something that wasn't quite as nice. It might be attached to a siphonophore. So siphonophores are massive, massive jellies that use tiny bioluminescent lures. So this is another strategy for dealing with not having very much food, because instead of trying to slurp up all the food from around you, you just wait for the food to come to you. And so they dangle these bioluminescent lures into the water, and then things that want to eat the lures come in, and then they get caught on the siphonophore's tentacles, and siphonophores have very, very strong stinging cells, so they're able to just eat up anything that comes into contact with. Right, my talk's a little bit shorter, so I've only got one final creature to have a talk about, and it's so horrible that its name means vampire squid from hell. And this is what it looks like. Ah! That's scary, isn't it? Isn't that scary? Right. Let's have a chat about the vampire squid. Now, first things first, how big do we think a vampire squid is? Yeah, right in the middle.
It is quite big.
This kind of big? This kind of big?
That big.
That big. Any advances on this big?
And it's got spikes under it.
It does have spikes. We shall come back to the spikes. Any advances on this big? Bigger, smaller? What do we think?
Smaller.
Smaller. Okay, so if it's not this big, is it, say, this big?
A bit smaller.
A bit smaller. This big?
No.
That's not a very good vampire. Okay, I was very, very lucky. I got to see one of these once. Vampire squid, even when fully grown, would sit in the palm of your hand. They're tiny. Now, what do we notice about the vampire squid? What's it got that's very big? In the middle? Yeah?
Its tentacles.
Does have big tentacles. What's it got that you guys have also got? Eyes. And would you say that they're big eyes or small eyes? Oh, that's pretty big, I would say. Medium. Oh, we'll go with medium. That's fine. So, why do you think it has big eyes? What does big eyes normally mean? Yeah? Say again? Yeah. So you might think that it's got big eyes so that it can hunt down prey in the deep. But it doesn't. That's not why it has big eyes. We'll go on to it in a second. Yeah? It is very, very dark down there, but it's not so it can see in the dark. So, one more thing about the vampire squid. It's covered in teeth. So this thing, what do we think it would feed on if it's got massive big eyes and it's covered in teeth? Yeah? Fish? It might do, but we found out a couple of years ago it doesn't. Yeah? You would think so, but again, no. One last guess in the middle? Algae, closer. So, the vampire squid is in fact a tiny, not scary, drifting poo eater. That's it. It just floats around the deep sea, and if you think about it, the deep sea is below everything else, right? So anything that goes on at the top falls down to the bottom. And this terrifying predator feeds primarily on just detritus and poop that's come down from higher up. So that's how it deals with there not being very much food around. It chooses a food that's more available and not terribly pleasant. Ooh, it's very bright. So, a quick recap. We have seen some jellies that sit on the top of the water because that's where all the food is. We've seen some jellies that feed by slurping up everything in lots of different ways. We've seen some jellies that are like a glass of squash and they just kind of dilute so that they're massive and encounter lots more food. We've seen some jellies that do all of their foraging right when they're tiny, so they've got enough food for the rest of their lives. We've seen some jellies with bioluminescent lures, and we've seen terrifying squid that aren't very scary at all. But the cool thing is that we only learned about the diet of the vampire squid in the last few years. The thing that's really, really cool about all of this stuff is that we still don't know about how half of it works. There are cruises going on all of the time where they take remotely operated vehicles down, like submarines, but with no people. And they just record and they pick stuff up and they try and understand how all of these really weird animals work. Because these are the kind of animals that just wouldn't work up on a terrestrial environment or up in the shallow sea. So I think the main thing that I want you to take away is that there's lots of cool stuff that we're starting to learn about how lots of marine animals feed, but there's actually still loads that we have to figure out. So yeah, that's all I have to say.